The chilly, gloomy day in Los Angeles seemed endless. A sharp wind pierced the streets of Skid Row, one of the most desolate and helpless corners of the United States. Barron Trump sat in the back seat of his luxury car, absorbed in his thoughts, until something unusual caught his eye. Among the dirty sidewalks, between makeshift tents and faces reflecting all the pain and suffering in the world, he saw a woman curled up in a corner, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket. There was something in her appearance that stirred unforgettable feelings in him, as if memories were bubbling up in his soul, and his heart suddenly clenched. He frowned, trying to understand what this strange, almost painful feeling was. Why did his heart beat so strongly? Sometimes, life changes in an instant. Today, we live in comfort and luxury, but what about tomorrow? In a year, 5 years? One unexpected twist of fate, and we could be at rock bottom, having lost everything. Barron knew this, but had never realized the depth of it until now. He turned away for a moment, trying to shake off the strange feeling, but it wouldn't leave him. There was something in this woman he could not ignore. Her eyes were hollow, her skin worn with time and sorrow, as if life had drained everything from her that was once valuable and bright. And then, in an instant, like a lightning bolt, it hit him. It was her. It was Mrs. Henderson, his childhood teacher, the woman who had taught him to read and believed in him when no one else did. He blinked a few times, trying to process what was happening. How was this possible? How could a woman who had dedicated her life to teaching and shaping children's lives end up in a place like this urban hell? Barron felt his chest tighten, as if the weight of injustice and pain had fallen on him. This was deeply wrong. How could such a thing happen in a world where people like her could be forgotten and abandoned? His gaze fell back on the woman, and he knew he couldn't just drive by. When the car slowed at the red light, Barron leaned forward. His heart raced, his thoughts tangled, and a lump formed in his throat. He couldn't take his eyes off her, as she tried to keep the blanket over her shoulders to shield herself from the biting cold sweeping through the city in the evening. Her thin fingers trembled. This wasn't right. An inner voice told him to drive on, that it wasn't his problem, that he needed to return to his comfortable world. But another voice, stronger and more insistent, told him he couldn't just leave it like this. Mrs. Henderson once lived a very different life. She had a modest, but cozy house in Pasadena, California, and every morning she would start with a strong cup of coffee, planning her lessons for the day. But for her, teaching wasn't just a job, it was about inspiring dreams, shaping character, and instilling hope in children, regardless of their circumstances. However, like everyone else, she was vulnerable to the blows of fate. First came illness, a cruel diagnosis that forced her to leave the classroom, and then the death of her husband, a blow from which there was no recovery. Her children, who had promised to care for her, gradually became more distant each day. She still hoped things would get better, that she would receive help from her children. But the calls became fewer, and then stopped altogether. When her health continued to worsen, she was forced to sell her house to cover medical expenses. Even when she reached out for help, her children put her off, citing their own problems. Each no was like a knife to the heart, and that's when she realized she could no longer rely on them for help. She had no money, no strength to work, and ended up on the streets. A shelter became her last chance for survival. At first, she felt ashamed, but over time, she convinced herself it was only temporary. Life in the shelter was terrible. People screamed, there were constant threats, and she fought daily for food. But everything changed when fate dealt her one final blow. A fire destroyed everything she had. There was no more house, and with it went her last belongings, photos, documents, a small suitcase of clothes. It was all burned in the flames, and she ended up in Skid Row, a place where even the last hopes and dreams die. Every day, her life grew harder and harder. Skid Row became her new home, the place where people lose everything, even their humanity. Dirt, cold, hunger, this became part of her life. She felt like a forgotten ghost, fading into the background of this world. That night, when she woke on the cold ground, covered by an old, dirty blanket, the pain was unbearable. She listened intently to every rustle, every step of approaching people, trying to survive. Looking around, she couldn't understand how this had all happened, how she, a respected teacher, had become forgotten and abandoned. But the worst part wasn't the hunger or illness. The worst part was the loneliness. Nights in Skid Row were a nightmare. The cold pierced her to the bone, and the ground was hard and dirty. But there was another enemy, the fear. She was afraid of everything, every noise, every step, every face that passed by, looking but not helping. And the worst part was that no one noticed her. Every day she felt herself disappearing, vanishing into this abyss of loneliness. She thought she was just one of many forgotten faces. In those moments, it felt like no one remembered who she was. And then one day, she had to climb into a trash bin to find food. At first, it was shameful, she felt humiliated, but hunger was stronger. These moments of disgrace became her reality. One day, someone gave her a piece of bread, and she felt gratitude, but also bitterness. But she still held on, still hoped. But what was worst of all was the absence of faith. Hope was fading with each passing day. Mrs. Henderson, once so strong and confident, was now just a shadow of the person she used to be. Her eyes no longer expressed knowledge or kindness, only emptiness. Every day, she felt a part of her die. In the morning, she would wake up not knowing if she would have anything for breakfast, where she would sleep, or most importantly, whether she would still be alive by evening. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, it became harder and harder for her to hold on. But then, on one of the cold days, sitting on the dirty sidewalk wrapped in an old blanket, she had no idea that her life was about to change forever. A passing car caught her attention. There was nothing unusual about a fancy car driving by, but something about this particular gaze stopped her. When her eyes met the eyes of the person in the car, she felt a familiar feeling. She couldn't believe it, but it was him. Barron Trump. Her former student, the very boy she once taught to read and write. At that moment, everything around her disappeared. She couldn't remember how long it had been since she last saw him. Her heart beat faster, and tears welled up in her eyes. She couldn't believe this was really happening. Barron Trump, the very young man who once sat in her classroom, was looking at her as if she was important. As if her life mattered. She tried to hide her hands, which were dirty and weak, and fix her hair, trying to reclaim some of her dignity. But it was all in vain. Barron didn't look away. He looked at her as a person, not as a helpless, forgotten woman who had lost everything. He stood before her as if not noticing her condition, and it didn't matter to him how she looked. He extended his hand. Mrs. Henderson, his voice was soft but resolute. She lifted her head, inspecting him. His face was different. He had become a grown man, but she still saw the boy she once taught in him. She hesitated, not knowing what to do. Her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. How could she, once so strong, end up in such a situation? But Barron didn't look at her with judgment. He simply extended his hand, as someone who saw her not for what she had become, but for who she once was. At that moment, something in her soul shifted. She took his hand, and without a word, without explanation, she went with him. When they got into the car, a silence hung between them. Barron felt how she curled up in the seat, trying to disappear into it, as if she couldn't believe this was really happening. He wasn't just driving her in a car, he was driving her into a new world, a world where she was not just a forgotten person, but one who deserved respect, love, and care. He drove through the streets of the city, not knowing what would happen next, but unable to leave her. Mrs. Henderson didn't say a word, only gazed out the window, feeling her soul gradually return to life. What happened? Barron asked, his voice quiet, almost inaudible, as if he feared breaking the fragile silence. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes and, finally, decided to tell her story. Pain, loss, loneliness, all of it had been too heavy a burden to simply forget, but in front of him, she could no longer remain silent. He listened quietly, not interrupting, as she spoke about her illness, her husband's death, her children's betrayal, and her slow, but inevitable fall into poverty. She spoke without anger, without rage. Just exhaustion. In every word, there was pain, but not hatred. Barron felt his heart fill with anger, but not at her. He couldn't understand how such things could happen to people who deserved better. When she reached the part about losing everything, he felt his throat tighten. How could anyone be so cruel to a person who had devoted her life to others? Mrs. Henderson finished her story, and once again, silence fell. Barron didn't ask her any more questions. He knew that there were no answers to all the questions. The world was cruel, and he didn't know how to change it. But one thing he knew for sure, he wouldn't leave her. He would take responsibility. For her, for himself, for everyone who had ever felt forgotten and helpless. They arrived at the hotel, and Barron was certain that he would do everything possible to give her life back. In the luxurious lobby, where everything was clean, beautiful, and quiet, Mrs. Henderson felt out of place. She, a woman who had once had a home, a family, and respect, now found herself in this world, where everything felt foreign and unfamiliar. But Barron didn't let her doubt. "Don't worry," he said, extending his hand. She looked at his face and saw not only confidence but also compassion. In the hotel, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was not alone. Barron didn't ask her how she felt. He simply made sure she took a hot bath, changed into clean clothes, and ate. When she returned to the room, her face was a little calmer, but she still couldn't believe this was happening to her. How had everything changed so much? When she sat at the table, Barron said they would fight for her future. He called lawyers, doctors, and social workers. He was looking for ways for her to return to a normal life. But the most important thing he gave her was faith. Faith that she still mattered. That her life was important. Days passed, and Mrs. Henderson became more and more recognizable. She gradually recovered, but the most significant change came from feeling needed again. She started teaching in a program for underprivileged children. Every day, she relived the same emotions she had felt before. Teaching children, inspiring them. And in that moment, she understood that this was her true calling. All those years she had worked were not in vain. Barron helped her restore her faith in herself. His help was invaluable, but more importantly, she regained her purpose. In the future, she would not be a lonely woman on the street. She would teach children, inspire them, and make the world a better place. And all of this was thanks to one important person, Barron Trump. Years passed, but for both of them, that moment changed everything. Barron Trump was no longer just a successful man, he had become a man with a soul and compassion. He knew this was not the end, but the beginning of a journey. And Mrs. Henderson could finally say, "I'm alive again."